Should I pick vigor, strength, or endurance? I don't know.
Lorden, I don't mean to rush you, but could you please hurry? We have been holding hands for the past hour.
Oh, sorry. I am just debating my choices. Do you have any suggestions on what to level up?
Just level vigor first. Trust me, you will understand why in the late moments of the game.
Okay, I guess having more health to take a beating is a smart move. Alright then, lock it in and imbue the runes, I guess.
Very well. Hold still.
Huh, Melina, why do I have so much runes left? I thought they were used for the leveling.
I apologize, Lorden. It seems that you do not have enough runes for the last level.
Ah, of course I don't. How much more do I need this time?
You just need one more rune for another level.
Melina, seriously? One. Cut me some slack, would you?
I am truly sorry, but that is the way it works. I cannot imbue your runes into strength without the exact required amount for said level.
Of course, it's a fromsoftware game. Why would I expect anything less? I suppose I could earn one more now? How to do so? Oh, wait a minute. That giant there has got some runes. Perfect. Melina, I will be right back. Wait here. Oi, you giant dumb fucking git. Hand over those
Torrent,
runes. That's right.
could I have a word with you, old friend? It is important to me. So good to see you, Torrent. Now, I know this may seem out of the ordinary, but what do you think of the women that are aiming for Lorden? Perhaps you can give me your thoughts on some of them. The first is Fia. Ugh, I can't believe Lorden allowed her to hug him. And worst of all, she had to sleep beside him naked to heal him from the frenzied flame. She's a loose woman. Gods, she sleeps with dead bodies. Lorden couldn't possibly like her. I mean, he's not weird like that, right? But there's also Nefelilu, who's currently working for him as his war master, and she worries me the most. She is spending the most time with him in all their drills for Lendel's armies, and worst of all, she managed to convince Lorden to take a bath with her. Torrent, you know him the best? Please tell me he's not into tomboys. Gods, I hope not. And I don't have to forget about Millicent. Now she came out of nowhere. And she may be a bigger problem than I thought, because Lorden actually cares for her enough to sleep with her while being half naked to keep her warm when she was sick. It seems that a redhead has entered the fray for Lorden, and she may be my biggest obstacle yet. 3 women trying to riz him out of my hands. Those bitches. What do you think, Torrent? What should be done about them? Perhaps I should not take any chances. The effective way to ensure that none of them succeed is to eliminate them. You may be right. Lorden would not stand for it if he finds out, but still, the option is on the table. Forget it. This is a bad idea after all. Please do not tell Lorden of this discussion, but do take the time to think of ways for me to dispatch the 3 of them if the need arises. I could kill Fia in her slumber when we get back. She does that a lot, and I just need to find a dead body and trick her into sleeping with it.
Oh, hey, I got those runes you needed and then some.
Oh, Lorden, sorry, you caught me off guard.
In the middle of the day, I am not that scary. Am I?
No, you just distract me. That's all.
Really? How about now then?
Oh, fuck. He's too good. No wonder women keep getting naked around him.
What? Well, that whole fight in the sky with Greyol was mad and suicidal, but the job is done, I guess.
Indeed. And what a fantastic job you have done, Lorden. Suffice to say, you are now my second favorite human being. But if you choose to spend more time with me, you may just become my all-time favorite.
He's busy. He does not have time for you.
I wasn't talking to you, maiden.
Well, she's kinda right. Got a pile of work to do in Lordship and Tarnished duties, I guess. But thanks for the help, Lansax.
It was no trouble, Wolf. And remember, You can ride me anytime, and I would love to ride you a lot of times.
Sure, I guess. Well, I'm gonna ask Gideon about some lore stuff. Play nice, you two. I will be right back.
What's the matter, maiden? Afraid of the competition?
I will stab you if you even think about undressing near him, lizard.
Oh my. Stabbing me would not be a problem, it would only itch. But if Lorden stabs me first with his other sword, that would be quite the view, wouldn't it?
Slut.
Virgin.
That's it? That's all they showed? What in the actual fuck?
Oh no, I was afraid this would happen.
Elden Beast, calm yourself. There is a logical explanation of why nothing...
Miyazaki betrayed us! He played me like a fiddle! Jeff, you bastard!
Greetings, brave, tarnished, and travelers of the fog. Thank you for watching this video. Your viewing is most welcomed. Please like, subscribe, share this video, and consider donating to this creator with a super or coffee to help ease his burdens. And if you are interested, please consider joining a membership with one of the 3 sites today to gain exclusive access to previews of the work in progress, with more benefits to come. And read The Godless Age today, an Elden Ring story written solely by this creator. With that, I bid all of you farewell, old friends. May you find peace on your journeys.